Every culture that has ever grown its own food has a version of today. Not a coincidence, a mathematical one. Right now, roughly 2,000 years of harvest calendars from completely unconnected civilizations all point to the same handful of days. The Celts called it Lughnasadh, Christians called it Lammas, Slavic tradition called it Spasovka and Makovei. Different names, different gods, same exact moment on the solar calendar. Today we're going to look at why so many unrelated cultures landed on the identical date, what they actually believed was happening in the sky and the soil, and what's genuinely useful about this day even if you've never lit a ritual candle in your life. Start with the astronomy, because it explains everything else. The period from July 31st to August 2nd sits at the exact midpoint. Between the summer solstice and the autumn equinox, one of 8 fixed points ancient calendars divided the year into, alongside the solstices and equinoxes themselves. Astronomically, this is the moment the sun's daily arc has noticeably begun shrinking. But the ground itself is at its most productive point of the entire year. That gap, a sun in decline, an earth at its peak, is precisely what gave this day its emotional charge for people who depended directly on what came out of the soil. You could feel the season turning even while your hands were full of the first grain. And what's genuinely striking is how consistently unrelated cultures arrived at the same underlying myth: a mother goddess, tied to the earth, thanked for what she produced. The Greeks built the Eleusinian mysteries around Demeter, their grain and fertility goddess. The Romans held Cerealia in honor of Ceres, from whose name we still get the word cereal. The Celts told a story about a god named Losh, whose name is thought to mean shining, who founded this festival to honor his foster mother Tailtu, a goddess whose own name comes from the old word for land itself. Slavic communities marked the same window as Spasovka, centered on Rod, the ancestral source force believed to flow through both the earth and the family line. 3 continents, 3 religious systems, 0 direct contact between the traditions that produce them, and all 3 land on the same idea at the same time of year. Something maternal, something tied to soil, deserves thanks right now. The English name most people recognize today, Lammas, is actually the youngest layer of this tradition, added by medieval Christianity. It comes from loaf mass, because the day's central ritual act was baking bread from the very first cut grain and bringing that loaf to church to be blessed. The older Druidic framing behind the same day was blunter. What you sow is what you reap. This wasn't poetry to the people who first said it. It was a literal, seasonal fact. By early August, you could finally see the real result of decisions made months earlier. And there was no more pretending otherwise. What's easy to miss in the more mystical retellings is how practical this day actually was. Communities didn't just feast, they took stock. How did the harvest actually turn out this year? What would get planted differently next season? In many regions, this was also when local leadership settled disputes and made new rulings, and it was considered a meaningful day to install a new leader. Specifically because a ruler chosen at harvest time was expected to govern with the same generosity the season itself was showing. There's also an astrological layer worth knowing, separate from the older folk traditions. This period falls squarely within what's sometimes called the Lion's Gate window. Running from July 26th through August 12th, the stretch when the sun transits Leo and, according to that tradition, the bright star Sirius rises in closer alignment with it from Earth's perspective. Ancient observers across multiple cultures took note of Sirius specifically because its heliacal rising once lined up with the flooding of the Nile in Egypt, a genuinely important agricultural signal in its own right. Whether or not you put stock in the more mystical reading of 2 suns, the underlying astronomical fact, the sun in Leo, Sirius prominent nearby in the same season, is real and long observed, which is part of why this window carries such a reputation for heightened creative and generative energy. The material customs around this day were consistently about turning abundance into a physical object you could keep. Communities bound the first cut sheaf of grain and kept it as a talisman until the following year's harvests, a tangible symbol that the cycle had completed successfully. Small woven figures and grain-filled pouches served a similar purpose, portable. Physical reminders of a successful season meant to keep drawing prosperity toward a household through the months when the fields gave nothing. Bread and fresh honey were the standard offerings at the table, and in many traditions, leftovers were deliberately returned to nature, afterward buried in the ground, floated on water, or burned as a way of formally thanking each element that had a hand in the harvest: earth, water, and fire. There was also, in some Eastern Slavic customs, a specific practice around release rather than gratitude. Women were traditionally permitted to formally let go of guilt they'd been carrying, described bluntly as forgiving all sins, often through jumping over a bonfire, using the fire itself as the mechanism of release. Strip away the mythology and what's left is a genuinely useful psychological structure, one that shows up independently across cultures because it works. Pick one fixed point a year to actually look at what you produced, name what worked, and consciously let go of whatever didn't. Most modern calendars don't build in a moment for that. This one, accidentally, still does, even for people who've never heard the word Lammas before today. If there's a project, a habit, or a version of a plan you started back around the spring, today is a genuinely good day to ask the plain question the old traditions built themselves around. Is this turning out the way I expected? And if not, what needs to change before the next cycle? That's not mysticism. That's just a very old, very consistent piece of seasonal common sense, wearing a different name in every culture that ever depended on the ground beneath it. Whatever your own harvest looks like this year, in work, in relationships, in whatever you planted back in spring, tell me in the comments what you're most proud of bringing in.